What is up, everyone? Almost 1 month ago, I opened up a competition where people could share their decks helmed by unpopular commanders that have less than 1,000 decks on EDHREC. The idea of the competition was to highlight some of people's favorite unpopular commanders, and then I would pick a few to share in this video and open up a poll to see what is everyone's favorite commander that I highlight. The winner would get a 3-tree city, and when I posted that video, I was expecting maybe 50 decks or so tops to be submitted. Considering, I'm still just a small channel, but the community pulled through and there were over 300 decks submitted. There were so many fun decks, but I tried to stick with some decks that didn't derive, their powers from just generically good stuff. Piles like Smothering Tithe, Jessica's Will, Ristix, or any of just like really busted cards. For anyone who's interested, the most submitted commanders were Multani Marrow Sorcerer had 4 decks, Jaya Ballard Task Mage had 3 decks, Selenia Dark Angel also had 3 decks, and there were 29 other commanders that had 2 decks. The rest of the 300 plus decks were all unique commanders. Before I do jump into the 4 decks, there were just so many fun decks that I couldn't pick them all. But I want to give a big shout out to some of the runner-ups. There was a Frodo Bandings deck, which was super cool. The deck used Frodo's ability of the ring tempting Frodo every time a legendary creature is cast to turn regular creatures into legendary creatures to then use with the bands with Legends lands, which in my opinion is as unpopular as it gets. There were cool interactions with attacking with a ring bearer that's banded together with a creature equipped with Nemesis Mask to force all creatures to block the ring bearer despite the skulk, and making people sacrifice all creatures that blocked. There were also lands like Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth, and Riftstone Portal, making the banding lands produce mana. But the deck was over $1,100, which is kind of hard to replicate, and I didn't think there was enough land tutors to fetch the banding lands consistently. Other fun ideas, Eartha Joe. I never even thought about it as a Super Friends deck, but that makes a lot of sense, and I'm kind of interested in doing that myself. There was a Caparocti deck, which focused on tapping equipment, which I thought is cool because, that's a card type that hardly ever gets tapped. So it's kind of tapping into untapped potential. There was a Grakma deck that used amassing orcs mechanic, which I thought was a clever way to get +1/+1 counters. There was a women's only Shauna Sisse's Legacy deck, which was hilarious, and a Meraxis of Keld Fling deck, which was also great. I do wish in that deck that there were more double up spells, kind of like Howl of the Horde, to double or triple on those fling effects, because you don't have to copy the additional cost that's paid, so you could totally one-shot the board. But anyways, thanks everyone again who participated. That was a lot of fun. So with that being said, let's, do this like I always do, in descending order from most to least popular commanders. The commander with the most number of decks was Hugs Grizzly Guardian, who has 830 decks. The deck is called Hugs, but it's really Zada. And this is a Hugs Grizzly Guardian deck, which the commander cost X and 2 green, and is a 5/5 with trample, and says, when Hugs Grizzly Guardian enters, exile the top X cards of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play those cards. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. So looking on EDHREC, most Hugs decks kind of go full big Timmy spells and big I win cards, like a huge Finale of Devastation, or a Crackle with Power, or other spells that you use when you just have a ton of mana. This deck, as mentioned in the title, is a Zada Hedron Grinder Secret Commander deck, which I thought is super fun. I've thought of that in the past because Zada is so fun, but it's limited to red. I liked it also because Hugs is an unpopular option for a secret commander, especially compared to cards like General Tazri, who can tutor Zada because it's an ally, or Sisay Weatherlight Captain, who can tutor for a legendary creature. But I really like the focus of this deck in Gruul colors, and I think that the focus on these two colors, rather than spreading itself too thin across 5 colors, can add a very unique advantage for this deck. So with this Hugs deck, it wasn't built like the traditional Hugs landfall decks. Yes, it does go wide with landfall triggers, but what I'm referring to is the ramp package is not any of the traditional green ramp spells, but rather this deck is built to draw a lot of cards and copy spells with Zada as a backup commander to dump lands into play untapped with targeted spells like Scale the Heights or Swell of Growth or Enter the Unknown. I actually emailed every person who I picked today to ask more about their decks. For this deck, I asked if they can reliably get Zada out or Mirror Wing Dragon, which pretty much does the same thing, and they said yes. They can pretty much get it every game with creature tutors like Eldritch Evolution, Time of Need, Court of Calling, there's Birthing Ritual, and over 20 cards that draw cards. So they don't even run I think the most busted creature tutor, which is Worldly Tutor. There are a few main pillars of this deck. One is to go wide with landfall triggers and cards like Avenger of Zendikar. That's, great. There's also great generators like Nesting Dragon, Omnath Locus of Rage, Phylath World Sculptor, Rampaging Baloths. We got Shrewfist Sproutsire, Spore Mound, or Zendikar's Royal. But not even, the popular Scoot Swarm is included in this deck, which I respected that decision. Other cards like Krenko Tin Street Kingpin works great with the buff spells that Zada runs to create even more 1/1s. The deck owner that I did message, they said that they have almost decked themselves so many times, in a good percentage of their games, they actually get all 42 of their lands into play. But due to the targeted card draw options that are incentivized with a Zada deck, like Accelerate, or Crimson Wisps, or Fists of Flame, Hunter's Insight, or Wild Size, they had to add some Devour creatures, like Thorn Thrash Viashino and Hellkite Hatchling, to act as like a population control to make sure that they didn't lose by decking themselves out. With lots of card draw comes lots of ramp, in the form of playing multiple lands each turn that come into play untapped. So here's some cards that allow the deck to play additional lands from, the 20 plus cards that they can draw. Our commander does it. Then there's Loot Exuberant Explorer, Minna and Den Wildborn. There's Wayward Swordtooth, Broken Bond, Enter the Unknown, Escape the Wilds, Scale the Heights, World Soul's Rage, and Swell of Growth. This deck runs 0 artifacts and only 5 enchantments. But there are answers to those threats like Bane of Progress, Pest Infestation, and Fade from History. Then as board wipes, there's Blasphemous Act and Chain Reaction. So to recap, this deck wins by going wide, getting out Zada or Mirror Wing Dragon, and then copying buff spells, draw spells, or ramp spells, preferably all 3, to just overwhelm the board. I do wish that I had time to go through every card in all of these decks today, but I just I don't want to make an hour-long video. But the total cost is $154, and I thought that this was super fun, and I kind of want to make a secret Zada Commander deck now. As a note, I shared a list of all 303 decks in the deck list tab of the Patreon Discord for people looking for deck inspiration. Most decks are public, but there were 1 or 2 that weren't public, so I wasn't able to view them. And also, if you did submit a deck, feel free to message me and let me know what deck you submitted, and I can also share the deck with you as well, as a thank you for participating in the competition. Up next, we got Malfagor with 608 decks. Malfagor is a 6-mana flying 6/6 demon dragon, that says, when Malfagor enters the battlefield, discard your hand. Each opponent sacrifices a creature for each card discarded this way. Okay, intriguing. I'm going to say right now, huge shout out to the person who did submit this deck. The description of their deck was 2,300 words. If you have an above average typing speed, I Googled it, apparently 40 words per minute is average. So let's say you type 50 words per minute. That would take 45 minutes to write. And it did take me quite a while to read through that description too. The description was very specific, it countered objections, and it shared a lot of details about the function and goal of this deck. So, one, aside from me actually liking the deck, I also respect the level of detail and passion behind the deck and the response, so it was hard for me not to share it. I did just mention that the person kind of countered some objections, but what objections, you might ask? There was a Salubrious Snail video about this commander several months ago, and this is what the person who submitted this deck had to say about that as a comparison. Quote, I'm aware that Snail Guy made a similar deck. However, his deck is not a Malfagor deck. His deck is a discard deck with Malfagor slapped on as a commander. He said so himself, but I'm not sure how he even wins with that deck outside of swinging Malfagor and Kroxa on an empty board with nobody having cards in hand for 20 turns. My deck, however, is a sharpened craft, honed and focused over the course of hundreds of hours, searching, testing, and refining. The delicate balance of symmetric and self-discards curving into subtly dangerous, cheap, fast-damaging threats, refilling your hand by your main phase and emptying it before combat. Repeat. And by no means is this deck repetitive. No single card does all three things all at once. You have to figure out each turn the fastest way to threaten big damage, continuously add to your board state the next turn, and get to no hand size. That is your sweet spot. End quote. I mean, come on. How do you not want to hear more about that? Hundreds of hours honing your craft? Nice. The other thing I will mention about this deck is it steers away from other, typical discard hero cards, which everyone plays in this archetype like Turgid and Waste Not. So I do respect that they aren't playing cards that benefit from other people discarding. This deck, as mentioned, wants to play big creatures like demons, dragons, or even minotaurs, then fill graveyards with symmetrical and self-discard cards, then reach the goal of having no cards in hand. It wants to run fast, and for that reason, there are no mana rocks, just rituals. There's Burnt Offering, Cabal Ritual, Dark Ritual, Desperate Ritual, Pyretic Ritual, Sacrifice, and Rite of Flame. This deck chooses to run most of its effects on creatures, so there are 46 creatures plus the commander. I can't cover every card in the decks I'm sharing today, but here's a few buckets that I saw. 1. Creatures that have a downside and thus are bigger for their mana cost, like Blood Rage Brawler, Dreadslag, there's Grimstrider, Hazoret the Fervent, Lupine Prototype, Mardu Outrider, Stingerback Terror, and Rotting Regisaur. So a lot of people don't play those cards because it has the downside of lowering your hand or some other stipulation. Many creatures and cards benefit from having no card in hand, like there was Blood Scrivener, Bloodhall Priest, Jagged Poppet, Neheb the Worthy, Rakdos Pit Dragon, Mindstorm Crown, Anthem of Rakdos, they said was a powerhouse in this deck. Then there's Case of the Crimson Pulse, Taste for Mayhem, the Biblioplex, which I think I've pulled so many times but never had a use for it, and Howltooth Hollow, which I've never even seen before. This deck doesn't play a lot of targeted discard, but discard to the entire board, like Cunning Lethomancer, Necrogoyf, Rankle-Master Pranks, Sire of Insanity, and Stronghold Rats. So if someone else is discarding, the player of this deck is likely also going to discard. And then there's a lot of alternate madness costs and ways to get things from graveyards, like Abyssal Harvester, Blood Speaker, which is actually a great tutor for this deck because it plays a lot of those creature types, Rivaz of the Claw, Dragon Shadow, and Dragon Breath. What I will also say is that I respect that this deck is not running any reanimation spells, either from your graveyard or for your opponents. I mean, I feel like if you're playing a discard deck, usually people, tend to go for huge, powerful spells like Breach the Multiverse or Reanimate or, Rise of the Dark Realms, because people, your opponents, are putting their best creatures into the graveyard, so you want to take advantage of it. But no, not this deck. I did ask what the weakness was and if it had a weakness to board wipes, and they said, yeah, it can slow it down, but one, board wipes are less common because people usually discard those cards in favor of their deck's main cards. But if there is one, it can actually be helpful in many cases because this deck's true weakness is a go wide board because it doesn't have a lot of access to trample over weenie blockers. So a board wipe actually clears out wide boards, and since a lot of the creatures are cost efficient for their CMC, they're able to get big threats out quickly. Plus, this deck is meant to be good at top decking. Lastly, Archfiend of Ifnir and Archfiend of Sorrows can kind of help combat the wide boards. Like I said, I wish I could cover every card in each of these decks, but I hope I did this deck justice and didn't skip any of the key pieces. Deck submitter, if you're here listening, if I did skip some things, please comment below. Our third deck today is Solkanar, the Swamp King, which has 543 decks. Solkanar is a 5-mana 5/5 with Swamp Walk, an ability that says, whenever a player casts a black spell, you gain 1 life. This might not, I will say up front, this might not be the most strong deck, but it was fun to see a route for building this commander. I've never seen anyone play it before. This deck has a strong life gain package and can get a healthy life total before the mid to late game, which can help to outlast other opponents while draining down the board and getting stronger creatures as a result. This deck also plays a lot of underplayed Swamp Walkers and things that don't normally get put into people's decks. There's also multiple ways of turning opponents' lands into swamps to enable those Swamp Walkers for free hits. What I thought was super funny about this deck is their nickname for Solkanar is EDHREC, and they said, win or lose, they always just have a good laugh at the idea of taking EDHREC on a casual stroll to visit every player's swamps. As mentioned, there are a lot of life gain cards that are triggered upon someone casting a black spell. As a result, this deck is heavy on black cards. Some of said cards are things like Staff of the Death Magus, Prism Ring, Diamond Mare, Paradise Plume, and Demon's Horn. The nice thing about Demon's Horn, Paradise Plume, and even Solkanar is that they trigger on any black spell, including your opponents. So the more players on the board at the board playing black, the better it is for this deck. With so many life gain, there's a lot of payoffs, which include cards that drain upon life gain, and also cards that get stronger based on life gain. Things like Blood Bond Vampire, Bloodthirsty Aerialist, Epicure of Blood, Marauding Blight Priest, there's Sanguine Bond, Scion of the Swarm, Starscape Cleric, Vampire Scrivener, Veto of the Dusk Rose, and Wall of Limbs. This deck doesn't run Exquisite Blood, but they did say they most recently added Bloodthirsty Conqueror because they pulled it from a pack, and I mean, you can't help not put it in when, after that dopamine high of pulling such a fun card. They do warn people, however, though, that if they see Bloodthirsty Conqueror on board, they should probably kill it, so an infinite combo doesn't come out of nowhere. There's multiple ways of giving out swamps. There's things like Blanket of Night, Contaminated Ground, Convincing Mirage, Evil Presence, Night Creep, Reef Shaman, Tainted Well, Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, and Zombie Trailblazer. I had never heard of any of those cards other than Urborg, and so that's what I think is so fun about Unpopular Commanders, is they encourage play of cards that usually never see play anywhere else. So once your opponents do have swamps, they're small guys that don't really get that much attention because they're small and simple, but it adds up over time with that chip damage with creatures like Blister Grub, Bog Raiders, Bog Smugglers, Bog Wraith, Filth, Morfiend, and Restless Bones. Aside from lowering your opponent's life throughout the game, this deck also wins from typical cards like Grey Merchant of Asphodel with the level of Black Pips that are played. There's Exsanguinate, and attaching equipment on Swamp Walkers like Lashwraith or Vorpal Sword. Or this deck also wins pretty often with commander damage. The deck runs usual blackboard wipes and removal spells, but less popular options as well for removal like Defile. The owner said that the deck wins over 25% of the time, and when I emailed them, they said they tend to try to be unassuming in the early game and avoid unnecessary aggression. They focus on doling out, these swamps to people while they get a footing, and most people tend to find it kind of funny and unique, so they don't draw a ton of early game attention. Win or lose, role-playing EDHREC visiting everyone's swamps is enjoyed by the whole table, and they said, it's the epitome of just having a fun time playing Magic. I just love hearing about, people's approach to the game, how they have fun, win or lose, and making it enjoyable for everyone else at the table without taking it too seriously or even playing super oppressive cards. So thanks so much for the submission. I thought it was a really fun read. Our final commander tonight is one that is actually pretty familiar to this channel if you've seen any of my shorts, and that is Nael Avizoa Aeronaut, who is the least popular Simic commander with 59 decks, which is just 42% as popular as the second most unpopular commander, which is Duggan Private Detective, who has 141 decks. In fact, there were 4 domain commanders in the least played commanders for the 10 2-color combinations that I covered in my YouTube shorts. If you're not familiar with this commander, Nael is a 4-mana 2/4 with flying, and it has the domain ability. It says, whenever Nael Avizoa Aeronaut deals combat damage to a player, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control. Put up to one of them on the top of your library, and the rest on the bottom in a random order. Then, if there are 5 basic land types among lands you control, draw a card. What I really like about this deck, and what I thought made it kind of stand out to me, is that it doesn't want to activate Nael's maximum domain ability by playing Prismatic Omen effects. Normally for these 2-color domain commanders, you want to play cards like Prismatic Omen because you want to have 5 basic land types. This deck still does play domain expanders like Lush Growth, Copyland, Convincing Mirage, and Annex, but it doesn't ever really want to get all 5 basic land types at once because they don't want to activate the card draw. This is the really important part. The reason why the card draw is not the goal is because it eliminates that pseudo scry effect that you just had to manipulate the top of your deck for. For example, if you have 4 basic land types, when Nael connects, you look at the top 4 cards of your library and you pick one to put on the top of your library. But if you had a Prismatic Omen, you now look at the top 5 cards instead of 4 on your deck, put it on the top of your library, then you draw it, which means you no longer have any idea what the card is on the top of your library. What I like about this as well is what the deck chooses to do when it knows what is on the top of their deck. They play 12 Clash cards, which is an extremely fun and underrated commander mechanic, which I talked about in another video. There's also Discover, Cascade, Miracle, and creatures like Eladamri Corvectol I hope that's how you pronounce it, and Rashmi Eternity's Crafter, which can cheat in creatures from the top of your library. Or there's things like Gamekeeper that puts the first creature you roll into onto the battlefield when it dies. Aside from Niall's ability, there are a ton of scry cards and viewing the top of your library cards like Prognostic Sphinx, Sifter Worm, Reason to Believe, Elvish Mariner, Nissa Steward of Elements, Celeborn the Wise, Cavalier of Gales, and things like Reality Chip, Future Sight, or Elven Chorus. I mentioned that this deck has multiple clash cards, and to get an idea of just how unpopular this mechanic is, Research the Deep is the most played card that has the clash mechanic outside of Marvo Deep Operative, who is a commander, and this only is played in 3,787 decks. That is 0% of the decks that are able to play this card. But with those clash abilities, here are some of those great payoffs that you can have by winning the clash. There's things like Spring Cleaning, which is a one-sided enchantment board wipe for just 2 mana. Scattering Stroke, which is a mana drain if you win. Captivating Glance, which lets you take a creature even if the enchantment is removed. Recross the Paths is recurring ramp. Research the Deep is recurring card draw. Woodland Guidance is a free Balaged recovery if you have 4 forests in play. And even something as simple as Guiltleaf Ambush can kill 2 unsuspecting attackers by turning the elves into Death Touch blockers. So this is assuming that you are able to win the clash. Here's some of the high CMC cards that would enable this deck to win said clashes. At 9 mana, we have Apex Altasaur. In the 8 mana slot, there's cards like Aminatu's Augury or One with the Multiverse. In the 7 mana spot, there's Sifter's Worm, Allosaurus Rider, Temporal Mastery, which, by the way, can be cast next turn for just 2 mana. Then Annoyed Altasaur, Marauding Brinefang, and Nurturing Bristleback. And there's also several 6 mana spells that I won't go into. The main area that, in my opinion, I saw was missing from this deck was board wipes, which is mostly handled in this deck by Apex Altasaur. And granted, board wipes can be pretty tough in Simic, especially if you don't want to play something like Cyclonic Rift. But speaking of board wipes, I did ask how this deck does against board wipes, and they said it actually does a lot better than most decks at recovering because there is such a large amount of Cascade spells, Discover spells, and 2-for-1 spells in the deck. There's also a good amount of counterspells and other removal. And the deck wins by casting a lot of big creatures, hopefully for free with Cascade and Discover effects, and winning with attack damage and buffs from cards like Elrond the White Council. Overall, I thought that this was a really clever way to build a super unpopular commander while also using very unpopular mechanics like Clash. Well, that's all the decks that I had to cover today. For voting, I will post a link to a YouTube community poll for you to vote which deck was your favorite unpopular commander deck that I shared today, and the winner will get a free 3 Tree City shipped to them. Thank you so much for everyone who did participate. It was a very hard decision, and I just, ended up picking some ones that I thought would be fun to showcase. Once again, if you are interested in checking out the 300 plus deck lists, then that is pinned as a comment in the deck lists tab of the Discord channel. Be on the lookout as well for a new competition in the future, this time with either background decks or partner decks. Which one do you prefer? Should we go with the partner deck competition first or the background deck competition? Thanks everyone for sticking around, and we'll see you again next time.